Hello, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We have already 230 participants, and we expect much more people joining us. Around 600 participants have registered to this event, and for sure, this reflects the relevance of this topic that we will be discussing here today with a lot of fantastic speakers. Well, as you know, we are currently facing some extraordinary time. The energy sector was already undergoing a huge crisis, but the war in Ukraine has exacerbated it, and raises concerns in particular about ensuring security of supply. And storage, being storage one of the elements to ensure security of supply, this is certainly an issue to provide certainty and stability to face the current situation that we are observing. And some measures are being undertaken to pursue its filling, which brings us to the topic of that we are discussing here: gas storage regulation and security of supply. Gas storage in the EU covers about a quarter of gas consumption, amounting to nearly 100 BCMs. And around 73% of this storage capacity is located in just 5 member states: Germany, Italy, France, the Netherlands, and Austria. And while some countries have great amounts of storage capacity, others rely on neighboring countries to fulfill their needs. And despite this huge amount of storage capacity and the different way how it is distributed among our countries, it is important to ensure diversity of sources from where these storage facilities are filled, avoiding to rely on only one supplier. And well, those type of issues will for sure be discussed today. Well, these extraordinary times place a huge amount of pressure on policymakers, demanding quick reactions and decisions. And against this background, the European Commission has done its best to provide a rapid response, proposing some measures to face the current constraints. On 8 March, it published the Repower EU communication, highlighting the key role of gas storage in guaranteeing the security of supply for gas consumers. This communication was quickly followed by a legislative proposal, which, among other measures, introduces a minimum of 80% storage level obligation by 1 November this winter, and next winter for this target is increased to 90%. In a couple of minutes, we'll be able to hear in detail about these and other measures in the proposal from Remy Meyer from the European Commission. And as expected, we regulators, we fully recognize the relevance of this issue, and so we have also undertaken some analysis which resulted in publication of 3 documents that we will share with you during this session. The first one is the CEER reflection paper on long-term energy storage from a sector coupling perspective, giving a first overview of storage solutions in the context of decarbonization and sector coupling. The second one is a report by ACER, giving an overview of the regulation currently in place for gas storage in different member states. And finally, following the publication of the European Commission storage proposal, ACER and CEER developed a document to present its views on these proposals. In Madrid Forum, we have shared the main topics on a slot of these proposals in this document. My colleagues from ACER and CEER, Benoit Esnault, Juan Lopez and Chris Quisper, will share with you the main messages covered under these three documents. Finally, broadening the scope of this discussion, we will have a panel discussion where I am expecting some relevant and enriching questions and comments from EFET, the European Federation of Energy Traders, Gas Infrastructure Europe, and the Florence School of Regulation. And before I hand over to Benoit, I would just like to remind all of you to please use the questions chat to submit all the questions you might have during this webinar. And at the end of the presentations, we will have also a question and answer slot where your questions will be answered by the speakers. And now I wish you all a pleasant event. We have already 334 people with us, so the amount of participation is increasing. And so, Benoit, over to you, and thank you very much to all of you. Benoit,
thank you very much, Pedro. And time is running, then I will rapidly switch to Rémi Maillet to present the proposal of the Commission in terms of gas storage regulation relating to security of supply. And then we can have a few questions to Rémi, but let's try to stick to the agenda. And then just to say, the Commissioner is with us until 10:45, so we'll try to keep a few minutes to have some interactions with Rémi. But anyway, Rémi, the floor is yours to present European Commission's positions and proposals.
Thank you very much, Benoit, and thank you very much, Pedro, for the invitation. First, can you hear me well? Just a check. I repeat, can you hear me well?
Very well, Rémi.
Okay, so then I continue. Good. So thanks for the invitation to present the Commission's proposal for regulation on the storage of gas, underground storage of gas. And before to start, let me perhaps make three preliminary remarks. And the first is that this is really an extraordinary proposal with extraordinary measures for an extraordinary situation. Russia's military aggressions against Ukraine, which cause on the energy market and security of supply tremendous disruption, in fact, and this is a reminder to the EU, to the Europeans, to end urgently the dependence to Russian fossil fuels, which we see are now used again as a political weapon, and this is a reminder to reinforce the resilience of the gas systems, among others. The second preliminary remark is that this storage Commission's proposal is part of the EU response to this challenge, to the war, in fact, and the goal being to refill, in particular, the European underground gas storage ahead of the next winter. And of course, there will be a second response to this challenge, to the war in the field of energy. This is the REPower EU plan, which the Commission will adopt tomorrow. And I can only invite you to stay tuned to follow the very important policy package, which will be presented tomorrow by the Commission. And the third preliminary remark, before I go more into the proposal, is that it's a proposal which is now being examined at the light speed by the European Parliament and the Council. They had the trilogue last night, starting at 5 p.m., finishing at 7 a.m. this morning. So I feel a bit tired because the Commission is used to participate into the trilogue. There were very good and fast progress, and now all institutions are very optimistic as to the positive conclusion of this procedure very soon, if not in the coming days. But my presentation will not be on the text which was discussed yesterday. I'm not authorized to say anything on it, but it will be on the Commission's proposal, which was done on the 23rd of March, bearing in mind, of course, that after the legislative procedure, there will be some changes, which is perfectly normal in a legislative procedure, and even more in such type of circumstances. So now let us look at the reasons of the proposals, which are mapped on this slide. First, the Russia military aggression against Ukraine, which I just mentioned, so a reason of security of supply. Second reason is that we want to draw the lessons from the last winter, during which we had to deal in Europe with lower than usual storage levels, 10% less in percentual point than the previous relevant years, 10%. And half of this gap was due to foreign-owned gas storage sites, and I'll come back to that. And the third reason is the summer-winter spread, which year after year was smaller and smaller, and this year clearly it became a negative, and that triggered a lot of worries on the capacity to fill storage based on market mechanism alone. Hence the decision to introduce this framework at European level to regulate storage and ensure a minimum level of storage. In terms of sequence, that was already mentioned by Pedro, but I think that's important also to have that in mind. First, announcement of such a storage proposal with a target in terms of filling the capacity of the EU storage, announced on the 8th of March by the Commission. 23rd of March, the actual legislative proposal was adopted by the College. The very same week, the EU leaders endorsed the principle of the proposal and asked the Council to accelerate its examination, also paying particularly attention to the question of a fair balance, and in particular for the countries with large storage facilities. I will come back to that. And yesterday and this morning, the trilogue, which is formally, I'm not even sure whether the trilogue was finished or not. I think it is formally not finished, and it has still to be completed in the next few days because of a number of technical verifications. But again, with a very likely approval in the coming days and endorsement in the course of the month and beginning of June by the legislator. So now, if we move to the next slide, which present more the content of the proposal. First, the proposal is about a target to fill 80% or 90% of the capacity of the EU storage by November. 80% by November 22 and 90% by November 23 and after. A filling target in 2022, which is a bit smaller because first the proposal will come later, will be applicable later in the year, so that will less time for the market to apply it. And this year was an exceptional year. We started with a very low level of storage. There is more than the target. There is a trajectory which is defined for each member state. Not the same. The trajectory really depends on the individual member states, and this trajectory, this national filling trajectory, will allow us, the member states, and collectively the gas caution group, to monitor the level of storage in Europe, to check that storage is being actually filled, and to avoid surprise before the beginning of the heating seasons, and to enable member states and the gas caution group to take action if there is a need. The regulation also provides a set of tools for member states to fill storage, so that can be incentives, that can be deterrent sanctions, that can be also the certification of storage operators, a certification by which the competent authority of the member states, which can be national regulators, will certify that the influence over the operator of a site does not put at risk the security of supply of the Union or any member states. And this is important because, as I said, half of the gap last winter was due to one company owned by a foreign entity. Then the regulation also includes a reinforced monitoring system linked really to the trajectory which I mentioned. So now, if we go to the next slide, on the next slide, yes, you have an examples of two examples of trajectories, and you can see that there are very different types of trajectories to fill storage. On one side, on the left, you can see trajectories, in fact, which can be multiple to reach a given target, to reach the 80% target or the 90% target. And on the right side, you see, on the contrary, a filling target which is quite constrained. There is not much flexibility left if we want to fill the target of 80% in November, given the constraints in terms of withdrawal capacity. There is not much possibility and the flexibility that can be left. So the message of this slide is in fact twofold. First, is that trajectory is fine, but it must leave sufficient flexibility to take into account the characteristics of the individual member states. This is, I think, what the Commission's proposal did by creating a bandwidth of flexibility within which the trajectory could evolve until the objective of 80 or 90%. The second message is that okay, the flexibilities are fine, but there is a limit to it, and at a certain moment we need to have a clear trajectory and a clear bandwidth, so that we can ensure a proper monitoring and know when to issue a warning and to say to the authorities, hey, there is something wrong here in the filling of the storage, you have to act. And that is really a key element of the proposal. Now I go to the next slide, which presents the in fact, the tools, the options that member states can implement to follow the trajectory and to reach the target of 80 or 90%. This is a non-exhaustive list. So in practice, it can be a combination of several of the measures which are on the slide. Obligations to suppliers to fill a certain amount of storage, obligation to storage owners to auction their capacities, incentives or compensation for market participants, use it or lose it measures to make sure that when a capacity is booked, it is actually used or lost. I think it's really up to each member state to define the optimal policy mix, if I may call it like that, in terms of storage adapted to its own situation. Now on the next slide, which is particularly important, the next slide is about burden sharing. The entrance of storage regulation offers is not limited to one member state, because the cost, the benefit is for the region, for the EU sometimes, and therefore the cost should not be limited to certain member states only. And member states with proportionally large storage facilities, and there are a couple of them, and Pedro mentioned them in his introduction. They should not be punished for having those facilities, of course. And therefore, the European Council asked to really look for a fair balance in terms of what we call sharing the burden of storage. Some argue that storage is a resource, this is not a burden, and this is true, but there is something to share. And therefore, in fact, the Commission's proposal is in fact based on a hybrid system of targets. A target based on capacity, as I said, 80% of capacity, but also a target in terms of national consumption for those member states without storage. For those member states without storage, the regulation asks them to store at least 15% of their annual consumption in member states with a storage. Of course, unless there are technical limitations, so not enough capacity in connections to transport this gas. Member states can also agree on a bilateral basis other types of burden sharing mechanism, and that's perfectly possible. But if they don't do that, by default, the rule will be that a member state without storage should contribute 15% of its annual consumption. Of course, needless to say that in the negotiations between the member states within Council, to some extent with the European Parliament, the parameters of this hybrid nature of the storage obligation and this sharing mechanism are very important issues and have been discussed at length, and there will be some fine-tuning, of course, which is perfectly normal, done by the legislator on the parameters of this hybrid nature of the storage obligation based on capacities or annual consumption. Now, on the next slide, in fact, this is the end of my conclusion. No, the next slide is my conclusion. This is my thank you slide. Okay. Which can be this slide. You can put the next slide, which is fine for a conclusion too. I wanted to conclude by first thanking warmly ACER and the Council of European Energy Regulators, and behind them the national energy regulators of the EU member states for the work and the analysis done on the storage. And here I refer to these 3 papers which will be presented to you later in the morning. I can tell you that this work, which of course the Commission could see, at least we could see draft of it before the final publication. This work has proven to be very useful for us in the Commission, but I can tell you also for the European Parliament and for the Council, who have referred to it several times. And I think this is really with this type of analysis which can inform policy making that the legislator could work at a light speed on an exceptional proposal for an exceptional situation. And now it will be up to member states to implement it, using again all the valuable information that you could produce, and this rapidity and in establishing this new framework for storage to make sure that we can fill ahead the next winter is really a good sign of the solidarity, unity, and the determination of all the EU gas ecosystem, in fact, to reinforce its preparedness. So thank you again for the invitation, and wishing you a good discussion. And sorry for being black. And sorry for being the man in black hidden in a cellar without electricity. I'm joking. That was not intentional and a small technical problem. Sorry for that again.
Thank you very much, Remy. Where not many questions in the chat. I mean, where there's a remark on the map mentioning that Ukraine is not in the map, but Belarus is. So I guess it's just a question of formatting. Any reason hidden behind? And no, there is a question on the substance about the need for a trajectory. So Remy, if you can say a few words about this point, why do we need a trajectory? But anyway, we'll be back to that also during the next session. But Remy, if you want to say a few words. And thank you for the kind words about ACER and CEER work on this on this proposal.
I think the trajectory is a direct consequence of the experience, the unfortunate experience of the last winter. We did not properly monitor. I mean, collectively, we did not collectively the EU authorities and member state authorities we did not pay enough attention to the level of storage months after months, and did not take action, reaching a level which contributed dangerously to the situation in which we were at the beginning of the winter. Without trajectory, we would have a lot of difficulties to make sure that the member states can meet the target of 80% in November or 90%, and this is probably better for everybody to not to wait the last moment to start to take action, but to have a progressive monitoring and therefore trajectory. Again, trajectory have to be designed in a way which is flexible enough, which reflects the technical characteristics of the sites, which can vary, as I said. But this is really a tool which is absolutely essential now in this crisis situation to monitor that storage works well in Europe now.
I was muted. Thank you very much, Remy. We have another question which just arrived, but actually I think we have to accelerate a little bit. So let me just mention the two questions. The first one is about what would happen if the filling targets are not met. And there is another point about the LNG facilities, whether they are within the scope or not. On the second aspect, maybe I can say a few words, just say it was not in the beginning, but the discussions that nowadays are developing about the inclusion of LNG. But technically speaking, it raises a few technical questions we can address during the Q&A session at the end. But Remy, if you can say a few words about what happens if the targets are not met, please. And then we switch to the other project.
Yeah. Well, this is very simple. First, this is discussed in the gas question group. if the deviation persists over a certain period of time, then the Commission will issue a sort of warning to the member states, which will be discussed with the other member states in the gas discussion group. And if the deviation persists repeatedly after several months, if it is serious enough to endanger the achievement of the targets, and if there is no objective reasons given by the member states for such deviation, then the Commission would take action and have recourse to one of the measures which I put on the slides, the tools that member states can use themselves. So be it obligations to suppliers, to stock, to storage owners, use it or lose it. So that will come at the very end. That will be decided on the basis of an assessment of the proportionality, of the necessity, and the respect of the rights of the consumers and those concerned. I think what is important is that this is really a monitoring tool for the gas discussion group and for all. We have really to see that. I think the most powerful effect of the trajectory is to be blamed in a way if you don't respect it, and not necessarily being exposed to measures directly from Brussels, because in 99% of the cases we can expect that a significant deviation will be addressed by the member states after discussion within the gas discussion group. That was my reply.
Okay, thank you very much, Remy. We have other questions that are posted by the participants. Unfortunately, we cannot reply to all of them. We are already very late. Thank you again, Remy, for your contribution. Now we are going to turn to the second session, which was also the purpose of this webinar, and where the idea was to present also the work of regulators, I mean of ACER and CEER on these storage issues. We have then 3 presentations. We'll try to dedicate 5 minutes for each. It's challenging because they are quite dense, but anyway, we invite everyone to look at the papers, to read them, and potentially to send back some questions in written later directly to CEER or the drafters. Anyway, so let's switch first to this question on the reflection paper on regulation. I will try to be very quick. I will not dedicate too much time. I think the important point, and you can switch to the next slide, Christina. The important point is that this paper was developed last year before the crisis, and it was part of the reflection on the sector coupling and all the issues relating to providing flexibility to the system. And we all agreed that storage would play an increasingly important role in the energy system, energy meaning gas and electricity. And the question was whether we could get some lessons from the gas sector to see what would be the need for regulation in the energy storage, also including some technologies for electricity storage. There was a first paper last year pointing out the potential need for storage in the electricity sector, and here we wanted to complement this reflection with some elements about the regulation of gas storage. Then next slide, please. Then here about the main topics to address, we had three angles. The first question is, let's say, largely conceptual, why and how to regulate. The second point was about what we could learn from the gas storage, where all these issues about what is the role of storage, whether we should have some third-party access to storage facilities, what kind of third-party access, and how to manage that have been addressed for a long time, and then to draft some recommendations for the future on several topics. I will be back to that later. Next slide, please. I think this slide is particularly important, just highlighting first the technological options that were at stake when looking at energy storage in general. And here the figure on the right-hand side shows the technologies in terms of electricity storage. The big question is then, what would be the relevant decision in terms of regulation from a completely decentralized approach, let's say batteries, for example, or towards a centralized approach? And behind that, there are, of course, some technological parameters, including economies of scale, but also some elements relating to the value of storage and the cost of storage. And behind this, there is this question whether we should centralize storage management, potentially bring that within the hands of some system managers with some third-party access, or whether we should keep this in the hands of market players. For that purpose, we see two elements that are important to address. The first one is the market value of storage, which relates to the value for market players, how to use storage in a market perspective to feed the strategies of market players. And the second aspect, which is the system value, which refers to the collective value of storage, in the sense that storage contributes to securing the system. And the question is whether the individual behavior of market players would fulfill these requirements that we see in terms of system value or not. And this is where we get into the reflection on regulation. Next slide, please. Maybe we can switch to directly to the recommendations. So we have 6 recommendations. The first one is about the long-term planning and to integrate directly the question of storage in the design of the infrastructures. That was something carried out in gas. And for example, in many countries, we have had a joint design of pipelines and storage. And that explains the it relates to the strategy that we should follow to improve the efficiency of the energy system in the EU. The second aspect, and Christina, I don't see the slides on my screen. I don't know if we are the 11th one or not. But anyway, the second recommendation is about using in a proper way the existing assets and use it as a lever for RES development. Behind this, there is this point about renewables could translate into some kind of scarcity. And the idea is that at least as a transition to build upon the gas storage facilities to bring the flexibility we need and avoiding to have too much losses when transforming an energy carrier into another. The third recommendation is to have a proper identification of the relevance of regulation and relating here to the risk I mentioned about the failure that individual decisions would deliver what is required in terms of security of supply and the functioning of the energy system. And if there is a clear benefit in terms of centralized management, then have some kind of third-party access. Next slide, finish on the 3 last recommendations. Then the Another point is about the role of storage in terms of competition, and here which justifies potentially having some third-party access. Another aspect is, of course, relating to security of supply, which is directly in the scope of the current discussion. And here we are addressing two aspects: the risk that storage facilities would be undersized, and the other is that thirdly, the storage facilities would not be filled at the proper level. And here we get into the proposals that we elaborate a little bit, which would be to articulate properly the market value and the system value of storage. Market value with, for example, some auctions with a process allowing to determine, to align the tariff to access storage to the market value of storage, and having some compensation mechanisms allowing them to cover the cost of storage. And then final point about dynamic approach to regulation, but I will not dig too much into this. And then switch to Juan for the second point about the second paper, which came to complement the first one, which was quite conceptual, even based on some case studies. And here to having a snapshot, to have a snapshot about the situation last autumn. Juan and Chris, the microphone is yours.
Thank you very much, Benoit. And I will ask Christina to move to the next slide, and I will try to be quick, not to eat the time of other panelists. A few words on the role of gas storage, also for setting this scene. It's probably well known for many, but gas demand presents a clear seasonality. It's higher in winter than in summer, mainly due to the higher residential gas demand for heating during winter. So the storage provides flexibility to the gas system. You inject gas in summer, you withdraw it in winter when it is more needed. And on top of that, as Benoit has mentioned very clearly, it has security of gas supply insurance value in case of disruption of gas supply. In Europe, we have very limited and declining gas production. We import most of the gas that we consume. So storage plays a clear and really fundamental role. The report, this ACER report, was published in April, and it came mainly as a follow-up action from regulators of the analysis we undertook on the ENSOC winter supply outlook. At that moment, we found it was relevant in the context of discussion on new policies and regulations for filling storages for next winter to have the best up-to-date information on the national gas storage regulations. So this report, as Benoit has mentioned, complements the CEER paper with case studies on selected member states, and it covers all the 18 member states with storage facilities. It relies on data primarily provided by all regulators until January 2022 of this year, and it also uses data from the ACER Plus platform and data from the Gas Storage Europe. Here, a warning on the findings you will see in this report is that well, some data may already be outdated, as there have been very quick developments to change and strengthen the national storage regulations in some countries, and I'm thinking here in particular about Austria, Germany, but probably also other countries. So what can you find in the report? It is essentially a fact-finding report of approximately 60 pages on the current national gas storage systems and regulations. It covers the storage availability per country, type of storages, description of the storage regulation, an analysis of the storage obligations at national level, the responsibilities for monitoring and ensuring compliance with the storage obligations, and also a few additional information on tariff regime, capacity products, and ongoing national discussions on the storage. So we are happy to hear in this point the words from the Commission that all this information provided by regulators was useful to inform the current discussions on storage. Next slide, please, Christina. And here I will reverse a bit the order of a normal presentation, and I will start highlighting which are the main policy-related relevant takeaways, messages from our report. The main finding is that the national storage regulation is a complex topic and is quite diverse across the Union. In terms of type of storage regulation, we see that 11 member states have opted for regulated third-party access rules and regulated tariffs. In the remaining 7 member states, the access to storage is negotiated between users and operators. We also looked on how storage was booked and used during the last winter, and we saw a few countries, Austria, Germany, Netherlands, Slovakia, where the storage was booked, but eventually not used by the system users, and this is mainly due by very low filling levels of storage that are used or controlled by Gazprom. The same as per the type of storage regulation, we see that in terms of gas in storage obligations, 11 member states have some type of storage obligations or a combination of different measures, while in the remaining 7 member states with the storages, there are no storage obligations at all. Again, this situation may have changed for some countries because national laws have rapidly evolved and they are moving gradually towards more regulation for storages. Next slide, please, Christina, just to collect some general information on the storage. The storage capacity is approximately 27% of the annual gas consumption in the Union. The storage filling level, the 1st of October last winter, was 10 points lower than usually before this 80% target. Lowest level this year was achieved on 1st of April, approximately 26%. And the last time I checked the data of NSOC for the storage filling level was 38%, what means that we've already started the filling season of the storage. 80 member states have a storage, 9 have no storage, but these member states without storage, they represent only 5% of the annual gas consumption in the Union. Anyway, it's clear that these storage facilities are not evenly spread across the Union, and there are, on the other side, some member states which have a very large storage capacities, much more than their national gas consumptions. This is the case of Austria and Latvia, and those storages are used at the regional level. And I will conclude my part of the presentation before handing over to Christian with the next slide, Christina. Just showing the type of storage regulation. We can see on the map on the left side in red, the 11 member states with regulated access to storage, and in green, the 5 member states which have opted for negotiated access. In gray, those member states which have no storage at all. The bubbles in blue, they represent the overall storage capacity. I think it was mentioned by Remy also that the top 5 countries, Germany, Italy, Netherlands, France, and Austria, they represent more than 70% of the overall storage capacity in the Union. And the pie chart on the left side shows that that most of the storage capacity currently in Europe corresponds to not regulated storage. We'll stop here, and now we'll give the floor to Christian, who was much involved in drafting also this report, and he will present on the book storage volumes, gas in storage obligation tariffs, and more aspects of the report. Christian, the floor is yours.
Yes, thanks, Juan. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. So next slide, please, Christina. Yes. So this slide shows the storage booking levels by the market participants compared to their actual filling level. Obviously, one has to buy a storage capacity before filling may start. So we see that on average, 94% of the storage capacity was sold for last winter season. In most countries, the level is nicely above 90%. So for instance, it's the case in Austria, Germany, Italy, and France. So that figure is not bad at all. There was, in fact, a high reservation level for storage capacity for last winter season. So if we now look to the level of gas actually in storage at the start of last winter, we see a different picture. We see a level of 72%, which was the lowest level since several years. Also an observation well discussed in the NSOC winter supply outlook. So by comparing the 94% booking level with the 72% filling level, we may conclude that 22% of the EU gas storage capacity was sold and in the hands of the market participants, but not used at all. So in Austria, Germany, the Netherlands and Slovakia were booking levels significantly above actual used capacity. So as we currently know, this may be explained by the extremely low filling levels of underground storages and/or storage capacities in the hands of Gazprom. This brings us to the question whether there may be distortive behavior of hoarding capacity and thus blocking access to storage for other market participants. This is not investigated in the report, but the table shows whether there are anti-hoarding rules, use it or lose it, secondary market and so on, in place in the member states in order to release booked but not used capacity again on the market. By looking to that, there may be an indication that in member states with those rules applied, filling levels tend to be higher. Next slide, please, Christina. So this map shows whether member states apply already or not storage obligations and what type of obligations. So there may be storage obligations on the holders of storage capacity or on gas suppliers or on TSOs or even obligations on storage system operators and so on. According to the NRA reporting, 11 member states report the existence of storage obligations, while in 7 member states no storage obligations were applied. This is the case, for instance, in Austria, Denmark, Germany, and the Netherlands. So the member states in yellow on the map. Also, with regard to the models applied for monitoring the compliance with gas and storage obligations, the picture is quite different across the member states. This holds also with regard to the handling of non-compliance, if ever observed. Next slide, please. So the report addresses also a couple of questions regarding the storage tariff regime in place. 11 member states opted for a regulated regime, while 7 member states apply a negotiated regime between the storage operator and the market participants looking for storage. So the regulated as well as the negotiated tariffs are generally the result of an auction. Also in the case of negotiated access, the rules are based on reasonable and non-discriminatory technical and economic terms, with reference tariffs published in most cases. Now we may move to the last slide. So the last slide is about the commercial model applied to sell storage capacities. We see again, and that's almost always the case, here also we see again various practices across the EU member states. However, one may conclude that the commercial shop of storage operators is well filled with different types of capacity products. In 10 member states, there are 3 or more types of storage products. So there are standard bundled products in all member states, except in Sweden, unbundled products, storage products delivered at the hub, pooled storages, and even cross-border products. Basically a very colorful picture, as you can see on the map. So it's obviously not possible to discuss all the facts and the figures from the survey. If you have still appetite for more statistics and insights from this snapshot of the last winter season, I would like to refer to the report on the ACER homepage. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Chris. And then we can switch directly to the paper we released on the gas storage regulation proposal. I will not go through all the slides, and what is important, I think, is to highlight the main issues that we addressed in that paper. The merits of the 2 other papers was first to highlight the concept behind the need for regulation, and the second was to highlight also first the problems we had during the autumn and the diversity of situations. And if we get back to the Commission's proposal, there's been some questions in the chat about, well, the 15% and so on. I just want to mention, and the CBAs, whether they've been carrying out, what happened was that we had collectively, well, the Commission and then policymakers had to collectively decide on something which is very complicated, which is reaching a certain amount of gas in storages, while in many countries that was not aligned with the usual practice. A few countries, like let's say France or Italy, were used to that, but others not. The big question was how to articulate a collective level of filling, 90%. Now we are talking about 80 for 2022, and the question of the individual issues, with some countries not having any storage, and this is what is addressed in the Commission's proposal, and the other aspect, which is countries with a lot of storage capacity. And in the past, what happened is that market procedures allowed to reach a very high level of storage. Well, this 93% that was presented by Juan and Chris just before. Now, so the proposal of the Commission, there was not enough time to run a CBA, and our approach as regulators at ACER was precisely to bring some elements of understanding to highlight the very practical issues that could bring to member states in terms of regulation. And that's why I would say the first thing is to promote some workable technical solutions. One aspect is on the filling targets. What we are promoting is to include some elements relating to demand, to gas demand, and to avoid being constrained too much by the storage capacity. For example, in countries where storage capacity is sometimes beyond the annual consumption, as the case of Austria, for example, having this 90% on the shoulders of one country would not be feasible. The second aspect was about then looking at the local circumstances and the actual risks some countries were exposed to. And that brought to having this reference to consumption as a first element, and then including some parameters relating to risk mitigation and the specific situation in the countries. And here we have introduced some elements, we suggest to introduce some elements relating to LNG, for example, LNG tanks, to have a more detailed approach to the different kinds of storage facilities between, let's say, the aquifers or depleted fields and differentiate them from salt caverns. And another aspect related also to the trajectories for filling the storages. And here, what we are advocating for is to be pragmatic and also to relate on the experience of member states and to introduce some more flexibility in this area. Then, in terms of burden sharing, I've said a few words about that. The idea would be to enlarge this not only to countries not having storage, but also to countries having low storage facilities. And that brings to these differences that I just mentioned in terms of storage volumes compared to demand. And that's another element justifying the reference to national demand. Then in terms of financing issues, here we all know that it's a very complicated topic. There is no silver bullet, I would say, and Remy mentioned the question of negative versus no spreads, the very high gas prices. I think we are all aware of the issues relating to this. The advice of regulators would be first to minimize the, let's say, the role of public funding to secure the system and to get towards a kind of insurance system. We see, for example, CFDs to propose some interesting options, but we see also from the Italian experience that it's quite complicated. Then I will conclude that there are also some other topics like transmission tariff discounts, but we could be back to that in the final Q&A session. What I suggest is that we switch to our panelists, and thank you for your patience. And if you can develop your speeches, let's say in 5 minutes, that would be perfect, and sorry for the inconvenience. Iraya, then, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Benoit. I hope the webcam works now. So thank you very much for the invitation to today's webinar. We would like to contribute with by presenting a recent policy brief that we published, and which provides some proposals indeed on how to implement in a simple way pan-European storage obligations. So first of all, let me just remind that in Florence School, of course, we welcome the Commission's recent communications addressing the issue, and also, of course, the work done on updating the legislative proposal on storage. If we can go to the first slide, please. What I'm presenting today is just, as I said, I will say in the next slide, it's not reinventing the wheel. It's a market-based proposal for auctioning gas storage obligations. So how would it work in practice? It would be a simultaneous multi-round auction where volumes are set either at European or member states level. Our model allows for both options alternatively, and supported by pre-arranged solidarity agreements between member states, covering, in case of emergency, the destination of the gas to be supplied. So if there is no emergency, it's, let's say, we can consider it a model working as a business as usual. But then in case there is emergency, then these predetermined solidarity agreements have to be activated. This obligation would fall on the shippers and not on the storage system operators, and the shippers would maintain the ownership of the stored gas. The auction would simultaneously allocate storage capacity in different market areas so that the market participants could reveal their preference related to the geographical location of the stored gas. So in practice, the auction would allocate storage obligations entailing a certain gas capacity for a given thermal year, for a given entry-exit area, and with predefined filling level obligations at selected points in time. And something I forgot, secondary trading would also be allowed because the winning participants in the auction could fulfill their obligations also with gas stored by a different party in the same entry-exit area. What is important is also that in this proposal, we would envisage that participants can bid at negative prices. And this would be obviously the case right now. So if there are expectations that winter-summer gas price spread is below the cost of storing gas. And in such unprecedented time of uncertainty, we also envisage that an additional payment to or from the party awarded a storage obligation could be assessed ex post. This is, again, an alternative to the basic model we proposed, and it would cover for these extraordinary times where price risk is very, very high. So if we go to the next slide, please. As I said, our proposal does not reinvent the wheel, but it is market-based mechanisms, and market-based mechanisms we think are to be preferred because while we agree on storage filling obligations, we also recommend that the proposals that will be implemented have the smallest possible impact on the functioning of the internal gas market. The merits of our proposals are, of course, the fact that it would be a mechanism that is already known to the market. So the actors which would have to implement it, for example, those who manage the capacity auction platforms are already there. So this would allow an easier and faster implementation. It would also allow easy monitoring because the instruments are already available, and we could monitor in a short time the risk of, for example, any missing injection. And in that case, we could, use it or lose it provisions could be activated. And last but not least, it's also a flexible mechanism, meaning that we proposed a basic model, but as I said, there are some additional constraints or additional objectives that we might want to apply to the basic model. Thank you very much for your attention. And sorry, next slide. Sorry, no, the slide before. The slide before with the thank you. I have to thank, it's not there. Okay, I have to thank, of course, the co-authors of this policy brief. Which was published about last week or 10 days ago, was co-authored with DFC Economics. So thank you very much to the other authors.
Thank you very much, Ilaria. I think you point out critical points which are of great attention on our side as well, which is to maximize the chance for the market to fill the storages. And this is to us really a critical point. Of course, it's really challenges, and that's why we are keen on having this kind of insurance mechanism, avoiding to disturb too much the market and distort the price formation. But I guess that Doug will elaborate on this. Then I would give the floor to Bojana Ashowski from GIE to present the views from the infrastructure operators, storage operators.
Thank you very much, Benoit. So I'm here to represent the interest of 30 storage system operators with around 102 storage sites in 18 different countries in Europe. So that means that we represent approximately 91 BCM, which is 84% of European technical storage capacity. I'm coming also from association which represent on the top of that transmission system operators and LNG terminals in Europe. Very happy to be today here. So let's move to the first slide. GAE was already mentioned a couple of times with the storage data, of course, that we represent, and transparency tools with AXI+. So here I'm starting with another map, which is actually showing the different underground gas storage regulatory regimes. Basically, this is something that we created based on the information that we are receiving from our storage operators. So you have different colors for negotiated TPAs, then regulated with regulatory tariffs, regulated with market-based pricing, with combined regulated tariffs and market-based pricing, and also those with storage obligation. So you can, from this slide, what I would like to mention is that not every European member state will start from scratch in terms of gas storage regulation. So the flexibility is very much needs to be given at national level to choose the most convenient instrument to reach the minimum filling requirements. So based on that, I cannot see the slides any longer. So based on the feedback from our members, we actually published this map where we represent the different regimes. And I would like to mention that this situation is before the release of the Commission proposal for regulation revising of security of gas supply, and also the gas regulation that was issued on 23rd of March. And there's a changes which are already happening in some of the European member states, as we've heard. And there's an implementation of this new storage regulation in April. So for instance, this is the Czech Republic, Germany, and Austria. So we are very much monitoring closely the changes in the national level. In the next slide, you can already see our proposals for the amendments. When we talk about the European Commission legal proposals on gas storages, basically, these are the thoughts that we are having on the perspective, and we're discussing with the European policymakers. So very briefly to mention of what we would like to say, because many of the aspects were already mention and what is from our point of view. So about the minimum filling requirements, this is really particularly timely when we talk about the periods of crisis and when they're not market signals, right? But as the storage year has already started, in terms of booking capacities, is it really essential to ensure that these targets do not constitute a regulatory change that could justify the revision of the contract clauses. In relation to the 80%, so reaching 80% for 2020 might be really challenging in countries, let's say, that have a large storage facilities, which can cover the entire national annual gas demand. So the related cost will be high compared to their security of supply needs. And the last thing here is that some other member states do not have underground storage, as we all know, and that's they need to rely on the storage market from the neighboring countries. And for this kind of members to benefit from the stock, a very efficient burden sharing mechanism could be implemented based on a number of different factors, including, let's say, the LNG capacities, the interconnection capacity between countries, and of course, the domestic demand level. But we heard that Commission already is taking this into consideration. About the intermediarity targets, which in principle can very much guarantee and provide that the gas is injected on time and not fully withdrawn before the end of the winter. So our thoughts are going on the perspective that there is a need to ensure something like that do not constrain market behavior, and this is really enable storage users to benefit to so-called arbitrage value, because the number of needs has to be revised. And also to have a possibility to reflect the extraordinary situation that we are all facing, and this discussion, of course, is very, very timely in these regards. We need to consider the implementation time of the proposal that is coming. Only the intermediatory targets has to be set in September, while we need to make sure that it goes and give the storage users the opportunity to revise the contract clauses previously which were agreed. So about the intensified injections into the storage before the next winter. So basically what GIE is doing, that we support really market-based pricing along, let's say, a set of different regulatory options. So the instruments which are market-based will help very much and ensure an efficient allocation of the capacities that we have in the storages, but the regulatory options very much needs to be considered to further capture the positive externalities provided by the storages. For example, here we talk about the system volumes. And the last 2 points I would like to mention is that security of supply reasons, of course, for security of supply reasons, the zero tariff for storage transport really very much needs to be considered, because this will help to reduce the cost for the gas storing. And the last point is in relation to the certification process, because this will impact most of the SSOs and will kind of create an unnecessary and administrative burden, which are also time consuming. Because there are some concerns for specific SSOs, and if this is the case in Europe, any measure should be explicitly targeted. And in these regards, we really suggest to consider the obligations and the requirements of the storages according to the existing gas directive and the gas regulation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bojana. I think you mentioned an important point, which is about the gas storage contracts. I think it's been also one of the points of attention on our side, and especially with this new target for 2022, we saw clearly a risk to have some contracts which could be terminated because of the change of the conditions of these contracts. But before getting to the debate, maybe I give the floor to Doug Woods from EFET, providing the views from traders and the ones who are filling actually the storages.
Okay, thanks Benoit, thanks CEER, ACER. You know who EFET is. I only have one slide. Let's get going. I often feel when we're talking about these things, we miss the point, and we have an expectation that the storage filling obligations will solve a different problem to the one we face at the moment. And the problem we face is that there is a global shortage of gas. We have seen continued increase of gas demand globally. We have seen coal-fired generation shut down faster than renewable generation has been able to replace it. And we have seen a resurgence of industrial demand worldwide following the end of COVID. And gas is filling that gap, but we have not seen the production fill that. And we are not seeing significant additional levels of liquefaction capacity coming on before 2025. So we're dealing with a tight gas situation. Storage filling obligations do not solve that gap. We will still require to be able to match the supply-demand balance on an annual basis, we still will need pricing signals to try to encourage what capacity, what production there is available to come to Europe, and we still need a price signal to be able to tell producers, to tell consumers to be able to conserve gas. That's not to say that storage filling is a bad idea. It still provides very important benefits in terms of being able to have a cushion to manage a sudden supply shortfall, and to provide some optionality around timing of interruptions. But let's remember, we're choosing between whether to curtail demand in the winter versus curtailing demand in the summer. And that kind of optionality is valuable, but it doesn't solve the overall shortage. The best way to match the supply and demand remains the price signal. We have heard threats of price caps in wholesale markets. That does not make the supply-demand imbalance go away. In fact, if you do not have signals that tell people to conserve energy, you may end up with a bigger supply-demand imbalance, which can only be managed by imposed curtailment, either by governments telling which sectors to switch off, or in the end result, TSOs will decide who to switch off in order to maintain the safety and security of the system. Both of these are less efficient than use of price caps in the market, where people can decide whether to consume or not, although recognizing that vulnerable customers may still need some level of support. Let me add as well that something is happening at the moment, that what we have seen is there's been a demand dip in Asia, which has released some cargoes or made cargoes available and resold back in the market, which means that the market has been able to act opportunistically and has been able to fill storage this year to a good level anyway, or is progressing with that. So the market will continue to react rationally. And I'll come back to that about the difference between the market having the freedom to react versus imposed trajectories. The second point I'd like to make is about the roles of storage. Storage is not only about security of supply, it also provides important flexibility to the system. And similarly, security of supply doesn't just depend on storage. There are many ways of providing security of supply. So my concern about isolating large proportions of storage means that you're also taking flexibility out of the market. That's not only operational flexibility, but it's also commercial flexibility. So the price shock absorbers that we have in the market to prevent too much price volatility. If you take out more storage, you run the risk of even greater price volatility because you don't have those response mechanisms. So let's be careful, about the impact of taking out too much storage. We often talk about security of supply as if it's on or off. It's either there or it's not there. I always feel the need to remind people it's about what is a probability of interruption, what is the likelihood you can remain supplied during certain events, and you can make that more firm, more reliable at a cost. And you should always be able to trade off, well, what's the value of that increased certainty of supply versus the cost of that increased certainty in supply. And I think that there's an open question around whether the inclusion of salt caverns, multi-cycle facilities, actually makes a big contribution to security, but it has a large cost by taking gas out of the market. Whereas that balance is very different for aquifers or for depleted fields, which are single cycle and therefore have a much greater supply security impact. So a question about what storage facilities are included in any security obligations. And the third thing I would like to say under that point, which has been raised by a number of questioners, I noticed Dominic and Katia and Borbala all raised questions about trajectories. It's the don't overprescribe obligations. We've seen the market respond to availability slightly earlier in the season. If we can see through price signals when is the best time to fill storage, or even if we respond to another event like, I hope not, but more substantial unexpected Russian supply interruptions, then to have fixed trajectories and fixed control points will drive up prices and remove the optionality of being able to meet the targets. So we have to have leave a substantial amount of flexibility in the market and some optionality around how these targets are met, or the cost of providing this level of security will be much higher. Thirdly, just like to say, yeah, we recognise storage has regional benefits and there will need to be some burden sharing, but there's not a one-size-fits-all model. Different member states have got different supply flexibility, exposure to LNG, different consumer profiles and so on. So we need to be open to negotiations and to different settlements here. But one thing we can improve, and I think Bojana mentioned this a little bit in passing, is we can improve cross-border movements of gas by fixing some of the bottlenecks that we have in moving gas west to east and south to north, and from storage countries to non-storage countries. But that's not just a physical and operational problem. We also have challenges around auction rules, which were not designed for the levels of spreads that we've seen at the moment. And a number of auctions have failed to clear because they have been moving up only in tiny steps where we have substantial price spreads between different markets in Europe. And we're currently working with ENTSOG on this one, but we encourage TSOs to adopt solutions on their own borders and start thinking this forward. And my final point is just to recognise in the traded market that filling gas storage takes an enormous amount of working capital. We were talking of something of 23 billion euros for German storage alone, and potentially an amount of regulatory capital, a large amount of regulatory capital if you want to hedge these positions. That is a big cost for market players to bear, and filling that must be paid for somehow. And so let's be careful about the mechanisms and the fines and the sanctions, or the market will just not fill storage. We'll leave it to the TSOs. They'll have to fill them as last resort. That will actually make things more expensive because they're less reactive to the market. It will take more flexibility out of the market, which will give us a series of other problems, and it will just make the whole thing less efficient. So let's work out what the right balance is. Let's have proper market-based incentives to deliver that. Let's work together between the market and policymakers, and we'll try and provide the greatest level of security at the most economic price. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Doug. I think that you gave quite a comprehensive picture of these market issues, and well, you showed how complex the trade-offs are today and in the seat of the regulators. Of course, well, the question is always to what extent should we be prepared to bad news. You mentioned some additional disruptions of supplies and so on, and I would say that these developments around storage regulation aim at providing some kind of additional security. Maybe I would have three questions, one for each of our panelists. Coming from the chat, I would start with a question to more the academics, to Ilaria, and about your reflections also, which we have also on our side. But there was a question about negative tariffs on storages. How do you see it to actually promote some injections within the storage facilities, and how would it secure actually to have enough gas in storages?
It's a very well formulated question by Alex, and I guess it points out to the real question. So do we really want to make sure that we have storages full, or do we want to facilitate flexibility of gas? It's a question, and everyone has his own personal answer. Ours is that we prefer that, in line with the Commission's proposal, that there is an obligation to refill storages, because we believe that this would serve the two main purposes of guaranteeing more security of supply and also lowering a bit the gas price in the markets. But I think it's important to point out that the fact I quickly mentioned, but maybe it didn't come through, bidding at negative prices is allowed, so that we believe that this would be a measure to encourage actually participation in the auctions. And in such a particular very extraordinary situation, we also envisaged that an adjustment ex post is possible. So obviously the whole proposal would work only if there are agreements, pre-established agreements, bidding on solidarity among member states. So there must be the compensation behind this mechanism, of course. And this could be done, as we proposed, also ex post, and because the price, the adjustment regarding the final price could be done also ex post. That's what we propose.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ilaria. Well, a very interesting topic to dig into. And then let me switch to Bojana. I mean, there have been some questions about these zero tariffs that you mentioned, also to incentivize using gas storages. To what extent do you see this as an effective measure, and how would you see then the cost recovery from infrastructure management perspective? The point was made in the chat that it could be worthwhile to delay a little bit this cost coverage due to the current crisis. How would you see this topic?
Yes, thank you. So basically for the storage, everything for zero tariff, I already mentioned. So we welcome the capacity-based transmission tariffs on entry points as from the exit point storage facilities, which were implemented already in April 2022. So basically, what I would also like to mention is, because also Doug mentioned that it was about the storage obligations, which are not sufficient, let's say, to reach the filling target. And there is this role foreseen from the Commission of a supplier of last resort for the TSO, just to complement of what was said there. So what we see is that such kind of strategic stock should be very much organized by the entry destinate by the member state, of course, and not only restricted by the TSOs, and at least for two reasons. So not to go in contradiction with the unbundling requirements, for example. So I think this is important, and also to build, let's say, a different situation already which are existing across the European Union. So the supplier could be a last resort in a system service where the provider and the market and the managers that you're having here with the shippers about the SSOs, the TSOs, and the DSOs could be thus public entities, or of course other stakeholders, for example.
Thank you, Bojana. Maybe a final question. I'm looking at the clock. And to Doug, I don't know if we have some flexibility, but we have many questions in the chat, but an important one was raised about market's capacity to bring the necessary flexibility, and the question about whether we need some obligations, and how would you see this potential contribution of the market in terms of flexibility? I would say, as a regulator, maybe I have I will have some points to make about securing the system, but how do you see the spontaneous flexibility, the potential flexibility beyond these storage obligations?
So I think Chris made a good point at the beginning. He says if we look at the behaviour last year without abnormal obligations in place, most of the market behaved quite normally, and storage filling was to a reasonable level, and it was only Gazprom's results that biased this to an unusually low level. And I think that if you take into account what was happening last year, so we had high dispatch of coal-fired generation in summer, which was driving up summer prices, and in winter there was no forecast lower. We didn't see a substantial increase in Chinese demand until after the end of the filling season. We didn't forecast the war, and really, despite the curve being not much in contango, there was still a substantial amount of filling for normal players. So the market will continue to do this, and we've seen the market responding even in advance of obligations to create levels of fullness. So I think we have to be careful not to kill what the market is doing itself by imposing stricter obligations that actually turn the market off from filling these things. So that's a tricky balance of how do policymakers, how do governments make sure or feel confident that the levels of fullness will be achieved without having to impose something. And so maybe I think we need some kind of safeguards and some kind of rules, but let's not go straight down to the very strict targets, trajectories, and control points.
Thank you. And to summarize that in a few words, I would say then we need to be collectively creative in order to secure our system in an effective way. So this, it's more the objective, and then we have to find together all the relevant solutions. There was a question about also a sunset clause on that. Yeah, I think that it's clear for everybody that we are living in a specific period of time, and the idea is to have that as provisional provisions, which would terminate when we would be back to, say, some normal circumstances. Well, thank you very much, everybody. Sorry for people who we couldn't address or reply to the questions in the chat. I will then hand over to Jan for the concluding remarks. Yes, so Jan Kostevich, who is a team leader infrastructure at ACER. Jan.
Hi, thanks, Benoit. Thank you all. I have to be very quick because we are already over time. I would just, like to thank everybody, especially, of course, people outside of the domain of ACER and CEER, Ilaria, Bojana, and of course the others, Doug and Remy, for all of your contributions. I would point the audience maybe also to the other work which is forthcoming from CEER and ACER, like for example the ACER CEER public workshop on the potential amendments to the European Grid Connection Network Codes, which will happen on the 25th of May. But of course, there are also many other events. Please check the websites of CEER or ACER, and then I'm sure you will learn many new things on that. Thank you all for the very nice presentations and the very interesting discussions, and I hope to see you all soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.